This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From custom domains to beautiful websites using their easily customizable templates that you can have up and running in minutes, e-commerce, email and email marketing, SEO, analytics, and scheduling, Squarespace does it all and has done it for us for the last 6 years. If you are a small to mid-sized business in any industry, Squarespace is the place to go for all of your website needs. Hop over to www.squarespace.com/Hugh for a free trial. And if you like what you see and want to move forward, receive 10% off your first order by using the discount code Hugh at checkout. Thanks, Squarespace. Hey everybody, I'm Hugh Brownstone for Three Blind Men and an Elephant. And let's just cut to the chase. Tamron's 35 to 150 millimeter f2 to 2.8 is spectacular. It's so good that it had me believing, looking at the images I shot in New York on my 27-inch display, that maybe our A7S III really could pull double duty equally well as a video and stills camera. No, I am trading down to the 33 megapixel A7 IV for that, but you get my point. What makes the lens novel is not the concept of a variable aperture wide standard to moderate telephoto zoom beginning at 35 millimeters instead of 28 or 24 and ending up at the long end somewhere north of 105 and south of 200. At least not for those of us familiar with Canon's EF35 to 135 released back in 1988, let alone Tamron's own DSLR predecessor to this lens announced in 2019, their one-stop slower at less than half the price these days, Nikon F-mount only, 35 to 150, 2.8 to 4 DIVC OSD. Nor is it the 4.3x zoom range that makes this new Tamron novel, at least not to those of us who realize that any 24 to 105 zoom available today has the same 4.3x variable field of view. What does make this 35 to 150 novel is Tamron's obvious ambition for this configuration with its even faster variable maximum aperture, how well it is executed both optically and mechanically, and the fact that, okay, fine, no other manufacturer is offering this particular combination of field of view and depth of field. Out on the streets of New York and in the Bat Studio, although I did not test at anything close to multiple focal lengths, apertures, near, mid, and infinity distances, and guys, no studio lens test is complete without this level of analysis, the new Tamron proved itself wonderfully sharp edge-to-edge from wide open, suffered no distortion of consequence, none that I noticed at all, actually, and controlled chromatic aberration, focus breathing, and parfocal zooming very well, if imperfectly. I found, for instance, that focus breathing changed with distance from the subject and focal length, but were fine for my primary use case, and the autofocus was silent, smooth, and fast. It did suffer from a bit of flare and ghosting on the one shot I took out on the street, only for test purposes, but it's not the kind of shot I usually take. And if I were to take this shot with artistic intent, it would have ended up black and white anyway, where this one weakness of the lens would have dissolved into a non-issue. By the way, there's a bird's nest somewhere outside. Anyway, that's true for me. Your mileage may vary, and that's fine. Though it should be mentioned that other shorter zooms, like Sigma's 24 to 72.8, Sony's 24 to 72.8 G Master, or Tamron's own 28 to 75 2.8 G2, do as well or better. But this is the more important point. Out in the real world, in the right hands, and under the right set of circumstances, hold that thought, the Tamron is so good that it really could be the only lens one would need, the only lens one might want, especially when the idea of switching lenses is anathema. Put differently, truly stunning image quality for a zoom, save for the flare and ghosting. Wonderful build quality, matching Sigma and Sony, with industrial design, by the way, which is basically the same. A full complement of buttons and switches, more than the G Master, in fact, from zoom lock to custom function buttons and a custom function switch to a USB-C port for who knows what firmware updates in the future, but in any case, clearly obviating the need for a dock. Though Tamron's assurances notwithstanding, I still wish that port had a rubber cover. The flip side to all of this goodness, of course, is that the Tamron is big, heavy, and expensive. More than twice the price and almost half again as large and heavy as its DSLR predecessor, though you do also get an improved autofocus system, even if it no longer has the lens IS the earlier model does. But maybe the 35 to 152 2.8 isn't that big, heavy, and expensive. It really depends on your frame of reference. So from now on, let's talk about that, one's frame of reference, to help you decide if this is a lens for you, rather than me spending any more time covering its specs and performance. Because I think it's pretty simple. If you are an event photographer, photojournalist, documentary photographer, or portrait photographer, or videographer, anyone really who loathes changing lenses midstream, operates within wide standard to moderate telephoto fields of view 95% of the time, doesn't mind the occasional flare and ghosting, doesn't mind carrying the weight of the lens on the camera body itself, and has the need and budget for it, yes, this lens is for you. What's with that bird? Which I guess means it might work for you even for street photography or travel, though I think at that point you might consider yourself a statistical outlier, in which case, welcome to the club. I don't know how many times and how many ways I want to say this. The Tamron 35 to 152 to 2.8 is a brilliant lens, save for that flare and ghosting. But again, in the right hands under the right circumstances, these should be no big thing, especially for the genres I've just mentioned, either because you're controlling the light or because the existence or absence of flare and ghosting will be far less important than being in the right place at the right time with the right people. Or maybe you and or your clients simply like the effect. I think that's called lens character. If you match the Tamron with a 40 plus megapixel sensor for stills, which means any of the A7R models other than the original, or the A1, or 8K capability for video, only the A1 within the Sony Alpha lineup has that, it's even more brilliant because now you have what is essentially, easily, a 35 to 200. This is not an idle proposition, that is, trading off lens reach for sensor resolution. I've personally acted upon that thinking. It's one major reason why I shoot with the 47 megapixel Leica SL2 and why my one lens for my personal street work, when I'm only bringing one lens, is the no compromise Apo Summicron SL35. Oh baby. Though, to be fair, I often carry a tiny Sigma 24 3.5 and a Sigma 65 2 or 85 1.4. Sometimes I leave the Apo at home and bring the Sigma 35 2. You could certainly argue that with the right A7R or A1, you wouldn't need to carry or pay for the classic 24 to 70, 70 to 200 combo. Call the Tamron less than half the price and weight of a pair of G Masters and have the added benefit of never having to slow down to switch lenses or carry and pay for two bodies at the same time, if you didn't need or want anything wider or longer or faster. Notice, however, that I am not extolling the advantage of its f2 maximum aperture over 2.8. This is because the differences in depth of field between f2 and f2.8 at 35 millimeters, at what I'll call environmental portrait or couple distances, say somewhere between 3 and 6 feet, are between 1.3 inches and 5.5 inches at f2 and f2.8 respectively. In other words, once again in the real world, you'd probably want the extra depth of field of f2.8 rather than f2. You might even want f4 to ensure that even with no tilt of a head away from the sensor plane, nose to eyes at least, which for yours truly is 3 inches almost exactly, closer to 5 from tip of nose to leading edge of ear, would be in focus. If you did want less depth of field, say an artistic choice to have only one eye in focus, or shooting video in a very tight studio space where you couldn't control the background for busyness, other than by depth of field, that is by virtue of lighting, framing, or some sort of jury-rigged cover for that background, well, the difference between f2.8 and f2 wouldn't suffice anyway. At that point, you'd probably want to go f1.4, or remember to scout location before you get there next time. Maybe you feel you'd truly need f2 instead of f2.8 because of low light. I understand, but Remember, we no longer live in the days when color film had an ASA as low as 6, think Ernst Haas, or black and white film had an upper limit of ISO 400, think Joel Meyerowitz. Shooting at ISO 12,800 with pleasing results on digital sensors is entirely feasible depending on use case, even when shooting a 20 megapixel micro four thirds sensor like the one found on the GH5, never mind the dual gain GH5S. Bringing even a little bit of lighting is usually feasible too. It's also worth mentioning that the Tamron only gives you f2 from 35 to 40 millimeters. At that point, the maximum aperture reduces to 2.2. It reduces further to f2.5 beginning at 60 millimeters and finally reduces to 2.8 at 84 millimeters, where it remains constant thereafter. On the other hand, you could just as easily assert that if you did need a shallower depth of field or wider field of view, depending on how wide you wanted to go, you'd only need to carry 2 lenses, say the Tamron and a 51.4 for a shallower depth of field, or swapping the 50 for a 16 to 35 instead of the classic holy trinity of 16 to 35, 24 to 70, and 70 to 200 combo. Although, if you truly needed or wanted to get all the way down to, say, 12 millimeters, and you did have that 40 plus megapixel body, you could argue that you'd only need a 12 to 24 to complement the Tamron, the extra megapixels allowing you to plug the gap between 24 and 35. At least for stills, maybe for video. I would agree with you in all of those cases. What if you did not opt for 40 plus megapixels? What if you insisted on a mere 12 megapixels, given perhaps your particular emphasis on video? I understand. We do own an A7S III for video, and I'm shooting with it now. Of course, you can't crop in the same way in 4K video that you can with a 42.4 or 61 megapixel sensor for stills. But as I mentioned earlier, I was taken aback when I realized that the Tamron, to my astonishment actually, made me forget, at least for a little while, that I had just 12 megapixels when shooting stills on the street. That longer top end obviated the need for me to crop as aggressively as I regularly do with a 65, 85, or 90. But no, the Tamron would not be my first choice for street photography, nor, as I said earlier, am I content to rely upon 12 megapixels. First, I am a primes kind of guy. I do like minimizing the weight of my camera lens combination in hand when shooting. I don't mind switching lenses. I prefer distributing the weight of my lenses between camera and a small shoulder bag. And I do print big. Although I have to tell you, Tamron's 28 to 75 G2 is a fascinating alternative matched to that A7 IV. Maybe you like the flexibility of the Tamron's 4+ times focal range, but would be willing to sacrifice a little top end for more room at the wide end. Of course, your first port of call would likely be Sony's just about half the price and weight image stabilized 24 to 105 f4, but having owned one and subsequently sold it, I think this Tamron is significantly sharper and tastier. You could also say to yourself, if I'm willing to trade off top end, why not go all the way? How about a 24 to 70 2.8 instead? Sony's G Master is much crisper than the 24 to 105 in my experience. It's only 3/4 the weight of the big Tamron and just about the same price during this Black Friday, Cyber Monday silly season in 2021 as I record this anyway. Or maybe you might muse, what about Tamron's 28 to 75 2.8 Mark II Hugh keeps chattering on about? It's half the price of the G Master and less than half the weight. Yeah. Then again, you might be a Sigma fan, which I well understand. What about Sigma's 24 to 70 2.8 or their 28 to 70 2.8, you might wonder. They are both superb. The Sigma 24 to 70 is almost half the price of the G Master as well, and the 28 to 70 is dramatically lighter, smaller, and a few $100 less than its bigger, wider brother, if maybe not quite as crispy. In any of these cases, you might conclude, I could make up the difference at the top end by leveraging, say, 61 megapixels of my A7R4. Good thinking. Why not indeed? While we're at it, why not primes? Like a 3-lens set of Sigma's I-series glass, say their 35 f2, 65 f2, and 92.8. Maybe the 24 f2 instead of the 35. In fact, I own all of these except the 24 f2 and L mount, but as I mentioned earlier, I do own the 85 1.4 too, which is extraordinary. That first configuration I just mentioned would cost about the same as the 35 to 150, be about as fast, but it would weigh a little less in aggregate, and any one of those lenses would be much smaller and lighter and faster handling on the camera itself than the 35 to 150. And the Sigma primes are better for controlling flare and ghosting, with industrial design I personally find more appealing. Not as good for focus breathing. What about Sony's 35 1.4 G Master, 51.2 G Master, and 135 1.8 G Masters? They are killer optics, just about the best out there, irrespective of price. At least one stop faster at every focal length than the 35 to 150. Once again, much easier to handle on the camera. Once again, better for controlling flare and ghosting, with better autofocus than the Sigmas. Though, I'm not sure about chromatic aberration correction. I haven't had them in-house for quite a while, and I've never had the 51.2 in hand. But what's unequivocal is that they would be just about twice the weight and almost 3 times the price of the big boy Tamron. And in any of these prime-based scenarios, as I've mentioned before, you'd have to not mind changing glass, and or you would have to be comfortable with carrying and paying for multiple bodies. Let me wrap it up this way. Did I mention that Tamron's 35 to 150 is a heck of a lens? I believe I did. And yes, as you might expect, this entire video has in fact been shot with one. On the one hand, as I said earlier, I don't really care all that much about the one image quality problem I did find, flare and ghosting, because I simply don't frame up that kind of shot where it is likely to be an issue in the first place. On the other hand, as I also said, I don't really care all that much about the f2 maximum aperture either. I experience it as a halo specification rather than something particularly useful, though again, your mileage may vary, and again, that's fine. It is an easy lens to recommend to those of us who shoot within the fields of view it offers 95% of the time, don't want to switch lenses between shots because we don't want to risk losing the shot or getting dust on the sensor, want something faster than f4, and don't mind the size or weight of it on the camera body itself. It's an easy lens to recommend for stills or video, as long as we're not talking gimbal work. Although, unlike photography, you will need to supplement it with longer glass if you want that narrower field of view and aren't capturing in 8K. I mean, you could use APS-C crop, could do that. But you simply can't crop it on 4K to nearly the same degree as you can with 40 plus megapixel capture for stills. Then again, pairing the Tamron with Sony's 21.8G, for example, for gimbal work, or Tamron's 150 to 500 for reach. Yeah, either or both would be killer. And for all of that weight, I have to say, with a suitable strap, I used Peak Design's wide strap, the second anchor attached to their quick release plate attached to the bottom of my camera, the weight was not intrusive while walking the streets of New York, even if the size of the thing was. Then again, no need to carry a second bag, even a small one for small lenses, and never having to worry about changing lenses. No foot zone, baby. I like it. Still, I can't help but wonder how much smaller, lighter, and less expensive the lens might have been if Tamron hadn't stretched to f2, being content instead with a constant 2.8. I wonder what they might have been able to do with a variable aperture 24 to 105. Finally, I wonder what Tamron could have done if they'd chosen to replicate the configuration of one of the greatest zooms of all time in photography, the ahead of its time Leica Vario Elmarit SL 24 to 90 2.8 to 4. How much smaller, lighter, and less expensive could Tamron have made their version of it, while giving us a focal range that, well, appeals to me anyway, than the 35 to 150. Although it is worth repeating that Tamron's own 28 to 75 2.8 G2 zoom is probably the best alternative to primes for travel or street work I've ever seen in Sony E-mount, as well as for our video work. We just don't need more. It's likely the lens I'll be purchasing for our A7 IV once it arrives, offering the same level of optical performance as the big boy in a smaller, lighter, shorter, less expensive package. Hold that thought. Though, If you can't, no worries. The 35-150 is, I think, well worth the size, weight, and price for those of us for whom it resonates, as I said at the outset. And in fact, I suspect a good number of us will swap out our traditional 24-70 7200 combo for one. If I still swung that way, Holy Trinity zooms. I know I would. It's that good. This video is brought to you by Squarespace. For all of your website needs, Squarespace is the place to go. Hop over to www.squarespace.com/Hugh for a free trial. And if you like what you see and want to move forward, receive 10% off your first order by using the discount code Hugh at checkout. Thanks, Squarespace. If you like what you've seen here today, please give a thumbs up, subscribe, join the conversation below, because this is an incredible audience. If you'd like a copy of our Streets of New York, the book, head over to www.3bmep.com/books. If you'd like to schedule a one-on-one video session with me for a portfolio review, explore or hone your artistic voice, select gear, and more, sign up at www.3bmep.com/booking. Finally, consider supporting our work by using our no-cost-to-you affiliate links down below, picking up some official Three Blind Men and an Elephant swag at 3bmep.threadless.com, sending coffee money via PayPal, or best of all, join us as a patron over at Patreon. However you choose to support us, as always, we thank you for it.